February 18, 1944, Attu Island. A wind like an animal tore across the tundra, carrying the kind of cold that numbed hearing before it numbed thought. A flashlight beam cut a thin, trembling line through the dark, and in that narrow circle of light, a dozen faces looked up, pale, frost-scarred, bewildered. The men who found them had to decide, in a matter of minutes, whether to leave them where they were, buried with the dead, or try to carry 15 strangers through a winter that wanted to swallow everything alive. This is the story of that decision. Blizzard Heroes, the dramatic rescue of Japanese female POWs, women who had been army nurses left behind in a collapsed bunker on Attu, and the small American patrol that chose compassion over convenience, hauling them across 8 miles of storm and death to a supply depot where medics could try to save their lives. The Aleutians were supposed to be a sideline in the global war, a remote chain of windswept islands between America and Asia. In reality, for the soldiers and sailors who fought there, the Aleutians were a brutal proving ground, where the weather was as lethal as the enemy, and the map makers had not yet learned how to make sense of it. Operation Landcrab, the American offensive to retake Attu, had ended, but the island did not simply surrender its wounds. It held aftermaths, blown bunkers, jagged scars on slopes, bodies frozen half-buried in snow. Estimates from the campaign recorded heavy losses on both sides. The numbers one saw in reports, thousands of defenders, hundreds of dead Americans, gave the impression of a finished battle. But battles leave things behind. Orders forgotten, small pockets of survivors, people trapped under collapsed earth and roof, breathing in the dark. If you value forgotten WW2 stories like this, tap like and subscribe. These moments deserve to be remembered. Corporal James William was 24, from Ohio, and had come to Attu with a demolition and cleanup patrol. He was not a leader by official command so much as by temperament, steady, practical, and unwilling to write off people because the situation looked bad. Sergeant Davis, older and war-scarred, had the look of a man who had seen too many sudden ends and had learned to weigh risk by experience. Private Chun, a Chinese-American soldier whose family roots reached to Shanghai, was young, quiet, and had the rare ability on that patrol to speak a few words of Japanese, a skill that would matter in ways none of them could have predicted. Private Kowalski was the youngest, barely 20, the sort who still laughed sometimes before the cold sucked that softness away. They were moving bunker to bunker, searching for explosives and loose ordnance, when the beam of a flashlight hit breath that came like steam from a cluster of faces pressed against 2 walls. There had been sound, maybe a rustle, a shift, and then silence until someone whispered in halting Japanese, "We are nurses. Please, mercy." The men froze. The logic of war pushed one way, leave them. The logic of humanity pushed another, help. Sergeant Davis thought of orders and of the patrol's mission. He thought of the risks, the weather, the time it would take, the danger of being bogged down while others might still be in the field. He could see, in the dim light, how thin their rations were, how threadbare their coats. Corporal William, looking at the women, saw something that made his jaw set. Not enemy uniform alone, but faces that were unmistakably human and exhausted. William asked a single hard question. Can any of them walk? A slight stir. One of the nurses, older, with a braiding of hair that remained neat despite everything, lifted her chin. Private Chun stepped forward and, speaking as gently as he could, asked in Japanese who they were and what had happened. The phrase he translated for the Americans was simple and urgent. They were nurses, they had been left after the fighting, and many of them could not move. 15 women in all. Some could walk with support, some could not. The patrol had to make a decision. They had a map, a compass, and a plan to return to the supply depot a few miles off. They had rations for themselves and not enough shelter in the open. They had no orders to process prisoners. They had a storm warning. The weather was closing in, and visibility would drop faster than a man could think. In that cramped, cold bunker, it would have been plausible, by every procedural metric, to leave the women and move on. The safest, most typical military choice would have been to secure their perimeter and get out. But Corporal William, with frost already rhyming his eyebrows, refused the calculus of safety as the final word. He thought of his mother in Ohio, of what he would want a man to do for her if she were lying in the dark, waiting on a hand that might not come. He thought of the way the women's eyes followed every movement, how trust had not entirely died. "We're not leaving them," he said. It was not a melodramatic declaration. It was a decision, practical and dangerous. Davis argued about logistics, but William's voice carried the conviction that tilted the balance. They would try. They had 20 minutes before the storm, by the patrol's best reckonings. They had a handful of canvas and poles, a few extra blankets, their own rations, hardtack, a bit of chocolate, tins of meat, and a determination that had more to do with conscience than with any tactical advantage. The men worked quickly, improvising stretchers from pole and canvas, binding bundles tightly with belt and rope. They divided the food, taking measured bites themselves and offering the rest. Chun, his hands steady despite his own hunger, moved between the women, translating and arranging. Yuki, the name would come to be known. The nurse, who seemed to be the leader among them, took stock of her charges the way a commander would in quieter times. Her voice was low, almost a ritual, as she counted and reassured and folded a scrap of paper she had been clutching into something precise and small, a habit that looked like prayer. They came out into the gray world and into the first hint of the wind. The patrol formed a human chain, a rope tied at intervals, running hand to hand, linking soldiers and those who could walk to the stretchers that bore the immobile. The plan was simple and brutal. Keep moving, do not stop, rotate carriers every 10 minutes, and aim for the supply depot 8 miles away. The men looked at the horizon and saw nothing but the sky and the same snow. They began. At first, the sky relented, and the march was only bitterly cold. The snow crunched under boots. The watch hands of the patrol clicked forward. A man could think in those early hours, of family, of absurd jokes to keep fear away, and joke they did, because humor is the briefest of reprieves. But within the hour the weather turned, and when it did so like a door being slammed shut. The wind rose in a matter of minutes into a wall. The first few flurries became a seam of white that filled the world. Sound changed. It was muffled, then stripped thin and sharp. Breath came out as steam and was gone. Visibility dropped to the length of an outstretched arm. The men tightened their grip on ropes. "Keep the line tight," Sergeant Davis barked. They had to maintain contact. In the whiteout, relationships narrowed to touch, to the tug of a belt, to a whispered name. Now narration shifts into the immediacy of survival. The storm was everywhere. Snow hit faces like glass. Eyes wept cold. The sick became colder faster than the strong. Each step required more effort. The snow claimed energy. The stretchers sank. They had to heave them free again and again, often on a single leg of support, while snow knifed into every seam. Once a stretcher caught and rolled. A woman cried out in Japanese, her voice swallowed immediately. Chun cried something to her, and she answered, a single syllable of understanding. Yuki's hand slapped another nurse's cheek, not cruelly, but as a parent might, sharp and necessary, to keep her breathing steady. Kowalski snapped first. The youngest of the patrol, his face already a mask of pain, stumbled and fell into the drift. He tried to rise and could not make his legs obey. Corporal William caught him by the collar and dragged him up, whispering commands. Kowalski's hands shook so hard he could not hold the rope. The men rotated him back into the line, but his steps were small and the cadence off. For a while he refused to be taken out by himself. The snow took little off the edges of one's will. What it took was relentless. Decisions were immediate and surgical. Feed now, move now, carry now, do not stop. Men began to fall to exhaustion. The rotation system broke down when someone could not be roused. There was an instance where the breath of one woman seemed to slow and stop. Chun, who had been translating and leaning toward them, thought she was gone. He cradled her head and spoke to her, words, partly Japanese, partly plead, "Don't go." Her chest rose with a small, imperceptible shake. Yuki cried out a sound that could have been a prayer or a command to death itself. They wrapped her tighter and carried on. There were moments that felt like moral clarity made visible. Once, when a soldier's hands refused to hold the rope any longer, Yuki reached forward, grasped his wrist with a firmness that belied how cold her own fingers must have been, and said something in Japanese that he later translated to the others as, "If the hands let go, the promise dies." The men understood more than the words. They felt the obligation as if it had been a belt around their own ribs. They tightened grips. They kept moving. Time had a strange elasticity in the storm. Minutes could be years. Hours could be breaths. Each small victory, a nurse coughing, a soldier's boot finding purchase again, accumulated like pledges. They were no longer only a patrol in a group of nurses. They were a single organism moving toward a common salvation. The landscape around them was a blank cruelty, but within the line of rope and breath there was a fragile civilization of care. The supply depot was a rumor at first, a vague brightness on the horizon, a shape that could have been a rock, then a tent, then the outline of a building. Men shouted, but sound did not travel well in such winds. Someone fired 3 shots into the sky, a signal that was intended to be read by friend and awful in its risk. A figure appeared at the edge of visibility, and then another. Medics, likely led by a man named Thompson, or so the patrol would later recall. There was a terrifying moment as the medics trained rifles, the depot sentries unsure of who this ragged procession was amid the storm. For half a breath, the rescuer risked being mistaken for the enemy. Then a voice cut through, "Hold your fire." Someone recognized the rope in the stretchers. Someone recognized the cadence of English. The depot's men surged out to meet them. Corporal William and Sergeant Davis collapsed into the hands of medics who were less professional in the theater of war than in the theater of triage. They carried the stretchers away as if carrying the last shards of a too complex night. Medics unwrapped blankets, checked pulses, and called for more blankets. The code's damage showed in pale skin, in fingers that had turned waxy, in the slowness of some breaths. But there were signs of life in most of them. A cough, a flutter of fingers, a tear that thawed on a cheek. Yuki was the first to look up when the medics worked. Her face was thin, but her posture remained as if someone might still be listening. She watched the medics like a commander watching the first wheels of relief arrive. She found Corporal William among the crowd, and for a moment the war dropped behind them like a curtain. She bowed, the old, formal gesture of thanks that brought the room to silence. William, who had not been given to sentimentality, felt himself suddenly a brittle thing that could be mended by small acts of gratitude. He nodded. There were no dramatic speeches, only a simple exchange. Eyes meeting, acknowledgement of an awful night survived. In the immediate hours after the rescue, medics worked with what they had. Some of the women were carried to heated tents. Those with severe frostbite had to be warmed slowly and watched for signs of shock. Some limbs were irreparably damaged. Others, with luck, would return to function. The patrol that had made the trek, William, Davis, Chun, Kowalski, sat in silence, drinking lukewarm broth, feeling the aftershock of adrenaline turn into a slow, weary grief for what might have been. The chronicle of that night did not end with the depot. News of the rescue reached command, and the story filtered into reports as one of many vignettes of the Aleutian campaign. The women were referred to in various documents as prisoners of war, and the title POWs would be applied in some accounts. The nuance remained. These were army nurses, survivors of a battlefield that had become a graveyard. They had been effectively abandoned. The labels did not undo the human realities: faces, names, scraps of life preserved in pockets. Years later, when the war had ended and the world had rotated on its axis, a strange and tender reconciliation took place. Yuki, the nurse whose leadership had steadied her companions through the darkest hours, sought out Corporal William. She traveled from Japan to Ohio to stand at William's door and say, in quiet, her thanks. The two met as people who had once occupied opposite sides of a conflict and now shared a memory that had nothing to do with victory or loss and everything to do with mercy. She presented him with a simple gift, an origami crane folded from paper browned by war and time, a small, fragile symbol of gratitude and peace. When Yuki later died, William traveled back to Japan to place that same origami crane by her grave. He did not come as a conqueror or as a man indifferent to the past. He came as someone who had been given a life in the aftermath of a choice, a life marked by a folded paper that meant more than any medal could. The crane was not a romantic flourish so much as a punctuation of a story that refused to be only about enmity. It was a small, ordinary act of remembering that bridged languages and former battle lines. There are few theatrical endings in accounts like this because the real work of history is quiet. The men who hauled those stretchers across the snow did not seek glory. They had no expectation of recognition. They made a decision in a bunker and saw it through with muscle and stubbornness. To call them heroes is not to mythologize them, but to name the ordinary courage required to do a hard thing simply because it was right. What remains, decades on, is not only a list of dates and casualty figures, though those numbers loom in the margins of any campaign history, but the fact of that small human drama played out against the indifferent brutality of nature and war. The cold became the antagonist in the story. It took as it pleased, indifferent to identity. The soldiers and nurses, tiny figures against a vast white stage, responded with the most human of weapons, compassion. There are lessons in such a story that are not easy or pious. They are blunt and practical. Moral choices often come with physical cost. Compassion can be a tactical liability and still be the right course. Leadership shows itself in clear choices as much as in rank. Yuki's small, firm commands and William's willingness to keep the line moving were two sides of the same leadership coin. And reconciliation is not an epilogue you can force. For William and Yuki, it arrived slowly, through a visit, a folded paper, and the stoic travel to a grave. This episode is also a reminder of the countless small stories that get compressed into statistics. A campaign map shows movements and objectives. It does not show a chocolate bar passed between hands in a blizzard, or a rope that saved a column of lives, or the way a nurse tucked a photograph into her scarf to keep a piece of someone alive. Those details are the marrow of history. They keep it human. If you take anything from this account, let it be this: wars are full of choices that have nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with humanity. When 4 men chose to risk their safety in order to rescue 15 women who might have been left to die, they made a decision that reshaped lives. They paid with exhaustion and with memory. Their reward was not medals, but the knowledge that someone survived because they would not let go. There remain questions historians will need to verify: exact numbers, the finer points of unit movements, and documentation that properly names each survivor. And those details matter. But the core of the story does not hinge on those margins. It is a story about people who, in an inhospitable place and under an avenging sky, acted in a way that honored life. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and share any other forgotten rescues you know. These are the moments that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to hear more of them.